Childless Rancher rescued a teenage girl from child labor. What happened next changed everything. Galveston, 1887. Heat buckles the air above the docks while a ragged canopy rattles like a sail ready to rip. Elias Carter stands in the crush, hat shadowing eyes trained by drought and loss. He came for seed, not souls. Yet on the platform, a thin girl steadies a tremor by gripping the post with ink-stained fingers. 14. The broker claims. Name, Lila Hayes. Her gaze counts exits. Men, ropes. Even the distance to the harbor like she's memorizing an escape she designed yesterday. A scarred bidder toys with a silver coin stamped with a serpent. The crowd watches him the way cattle watch a cougar. When he lifts 2 fingers, the broker smiles as though a paper has already been signed. The girl doesn't blink. Instead she mouths something 1 syllable toward Elias, not Lila. A warning, a number. It lands in him like a dropped match. Wind flips ledgers, a page tears loose, skittering to his boot. Columns of initials, sums and a crest he recognizes from a burned barn upriver. The girl sees him see it, then angles her wrist to expose a fresh rope mark she kept hidden beneath a dull ribbon. Someone in the back hisses, "Keep the brat quiet." Another voice answers, "Ledger first." Elias raises his hand before he decides why. $50. Laughter breaks around him, mean and certain. The scarred man's smile lifts only 1 corner. He taps the serpent coin against his teeth. Somewhere beyond the wharf thunder grumbles. Though the sky holds no storm, the girl tilts her chin a fraction, as if aligning a shot. The broker lifts the gavel. A pistol cocks behind the canvas. Elias smells smoke that isn't there yet. And the girl whispers that single syllable again. The gavel falls. What happened next will shock you. Elias Carter, 42, wore a face cut by wind and work. The sort that turned smiles into rare, careful gifts. He moved like a man who had learned to weigh every step against cost. Lean months had pared him down. Drought had taught silence. Inland, wires stretched across hungry acreage, troughs baked dry, and a windmill squealed whenever gusts shifted. At home, quiet filled corners where laughter used to sit. Margaret, 38, had once met him at the gate with stories and plans. Now she measured sentences, folding hope into chores so it would not bruise. Childlessness had not erased tenderness between them, but it had thinned the thread that tied ordinary days to celebration. They moved through duties with care, grieving a dream neither wanted to name out loud. He came to Galveston for staples and maybe a mule, not to bid on any life. Yet the auction drew him under a faded canvas where desperation was catalogued and sold. Families pressed in, faces strained by hunger and debt. A broker called lots in a voice oiled by practice, turning grief into arithmetic. Tar, salt, fish, cigar smoke and heat layered the air. On the platform stood children, most too small for the work they would be driven to do, clothes thinned by years, eyes burning with stubbornness or emptiness depending on how many days had passed since a decent meal. Elias meant to keep moving. Then he saw a slight girl whose stance refused pity. 14, the caller said. Lila Hayes. Her hands were still, her chin set. Ink stains marked her fingers. She watched the crowd like a clerk watches columns, counting exits, weighing distance, noting which men could force outcomes and which only pretended. A scarred bidder at the rail flipped a silver coin as if he owned the cadence of the day. Amos Reed. The name traveled through whispers attached to broken contracts and bruised faces. The price crawled. Lila did not plead. She counted. Elias lifted his hand and said 50 before caution finished its argument. The gavel fell, paper slid across a crate. The crowd turned to the next lot. Lila took a tin cup from someone, drank and looked over the rim at him as if to say the first transaction had ended. And now they should decide the terms that actually mattered. He told her his name, that she had a place, food, a bed, honest work, payment when earned, safety enforced without debate. She nodded once, provisional. They left the wharf passing fish stalls and shouting boys. Elias bought flour, lye nails, cartridge boxes and a spare buckle. At the telegraph office he wrote Margaret a short message. Home by dusk, bringing help. The clerk sent it with a neutral face that suggested neither blessing nor objection. Elias drove the wagon onto the rutted road that shouldered the bay, then inland toward chalky flats, scrub and low water. Wind pushed grit under hats and into teeth. Lila sat under a woven hat. Margaret seldom wore any more, watching everything. She counted fence posts, matched cloud shadows to terrain, and tested the time by the angle of sunlight across the seat board. She traced an invisible map: freight station, bent live oak, shallow creek, a blackened stump where lightning had bit last spring. When he offered jerky and a biscuit, she broke each into measured bites, tucking a piece away as if securing a coin. Elias tried small talk: horses, storms, sun. She answered with care, neither bold nor shy. Numbers, she said, came from a counting house in town, columns that had to end exactly right. Her tone conveyed competence without inviting more. He chose patience over questions, and instead told her about the place she would reach before dark. A plain house whitewashed against heat, 2 corrals, a tack room that smelled of oil and leather, a peach tree Margaret nursed with stubborn devotion, though fruit had grown scarce. He described Jonah Blake, the foreman who had been loyal through busted years, and the bull that sulked near the north lot, and the wind after first rain when yucca lit the hills like lanterns. He promised fair rules. No man would put his hands on her, and she watched his hands on the lines, testing the weight behind promises. A freight team rattled past, barrels clinking. Lila's eyes flicked from wheel to wheel, as if listening for defects. They crossed a creek broken into warm puddle. She stepped down, cooled her wrists, and pointed toward a set of tracks vanishing into scrub. "Wolf," she said. Elias smiled despite himself, not at danger but at the exactness of her notice. Back on the seat, she resumed count. By late light, pasture rolled open, posts marching toward shallow hills, the house set square against gold. Margaret came to the porch, lifted a hand against glare, and saw them. Sun warmed brown through her hair and softened the edge drought had carved at her mouth. Her smile arrived before caution, because welcome was habit, then tempered when memory brought price and risk. Elias climbed down and helped Lila to the ground. "Welcome to our home," Margaret said, extending her hand. Lila shook it briefly, eyes taking in pump, shed, porch steps, and the line where dog prints crossed and disappeared. Inside, beans simmered on the back of the stove, coffee rested beside them. Margaret set a plate without fuss, poured water, and asked only whether Lila minded cats, because a stray often napped under the table. Lila ate in tidy bites, posture straight. Margaret's questions avoided intrusion. Shoe size for later, quilt weight for cold nights, whether green beans should keep their snap or melt. Lila's answers stayed short, opening by degrees when cloth and warmth, not interrogation, framed the exchange. After supper, Elias walked her through the yard. He pointed out the barn, the smokehouse, the hen run, the woodpile, and the bunkhouse where Jonah slept with 2 hands. He warned her about the windmill counterweight, the pump handle, and the bull's temper. She nodded, counting doors and measuring distances. He showed a small room off the porch, a narrow bed, a chest, pegs, and a window facing east to catch first light. "A place that's yours," he said. She placed the hat on a peg and studied it as if expecting someone to snatch the gesture back. Margaret brought a plain dress and a bar of soap. "Tomorrow we'll mend what we can and trade for what we can't," she said. Lila murmured thanks, the way a clerk initials a ledger, acknowledgement without surrender. Dusk gathered purple along the fence line while crickets tuned their thin choir. Jonah came by to give counts and mention a stretch of wire bowed by a leaning post. He tipped his chin to Lila, said evening, then returned to the weather without prying. Elias noted it and felt gratitude, kindness that avoided spectacle. Margaret watched the girl without clutching, hope rising despite lessons taught by barren years. They had learned that hope could cut, yet here it was again, bright as a fresh coin. Chores finished, Elias outlined rules. Rise with first light, share breakfast, then start with simple tasks, until judgment could be trusted. Feed hens, bring kindling, skim cream, sweep, ride the fence with Jonah or Elias when asked. No leaving the yard alone, no talking with strangers on the road. If anyone came asking, find one of them first. He spoke calmly to make the shape of safety known. Lila agreed with a single nod. After she settled, he told Margaret what had pulled him to bid. Not pity, not some grand plan, only the recognition that the girl's refusal to beg matched something inside him that had not dried out yet. Margaret listened, hands stilled on a dish towel. "Maybe we were given a chance," she said, barely above a whisper. "I want to keep her safe." Elias said he would keep that line. He believed it because saying it out loud made his back straighten in a way that felt like a vow. Down the hall, Lila lay on her back, shoes aligned beneath the bed, ribbon on the peg, eyes on a faint square of moonlight on the ceiling. She replayed the day in order to set it, the way a careful mind sets figures before trust can be placed on the total boards. Whistles, the scarred bitter tapping silver, 50 spoken clean, road, creek, oaks, gate porch, a room with its own window. She pictured roads out and roads home. She pictured a ledger kept safe somewhere only she could reach. She heard frogs begin by the tank, and the porch step complain softly as Margaret checked the latch. Sleep, she told herself. Wake before dawn. Listen. In the next room, Margaret lay awake with a hand flat on her chest, feeling hope thrum like a skittish colt. Elias sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced his boots, thinking about seed, wire, grazing plans and a girl who had insisted on being counted rather than pitied. Beyond the yard, wind slid over grass in long strokes. The night did not promise rain. Still the house held a faint new shape, as if an empty place had been measured for occupying. Morning would test every word he had spoken, and he found that he welcomed the test. Finally, dawn lifted over the Carter ranch like a thin coin, and Lila was up before the rooster, moving quietly as a shadow through the small room. She folded her blanket, set her ribbon on the peg, laced borrowed boots, and stepped onto boards that still held night's cool. At the pump she worked the handle until water ran clear, washed dust from her face, and breathed the scent of iron and mesquite. Jonah crossed the yard with a bucket, offered a nod and pointed her toward the woodpile. She split kindling with measured strokes, stacked it neatly, then brought a scuttle to the stove where Margaret was coaxing flame. The kitchen welcomed competence without chatter. Margaret set coffee to perk, passed Lila a pan, and showed the morning order. Feed hens, skim cream, sweep, wipe the table in long lines that leave no streaks. Lila listened, met each direction with a brief acknowledgement, and moved on to the next task as though she had always belonged to such a rhythm. Outside the wind worried the wire and made the windmill complain. By the tack room door a lame hinge rasped. Lila heard it, fetched oil and worked the pin until the sound settled into a smooth hinge's sigh. When the first light pushed fully over the ridge, she carried buckets to the trough, measured the drop against a scratch on the post, and marked the number in her head. Elias stepped from the barn wiping his hands, and watched without announcing judgment. He saw efficiency paired with caution, not bravado. It pleased him more than speed. Breakfast ran on rails, plates set, cups filled, simple grace spoken, chores assigned. Lila ate with small steady bites, eyes alert without skittering. When Margaret asked for help with dough, Lila washed, dried and stood ready. Fingers learned the turn that needs without tearing. She carried the calm of the ledger into every motion, and the room felt steadier for. Margaret noticed and placed a hand, light as a moth's wing, on the girl's shoulder when the bread went into the oven. Lila didn't flinch. She simply looked up and held the gaze for a heartbeat that carried more meaning than words permitted. Yard work came next. Jonah brought a coil of rope and asked her to dress it properly. She shook loops free, banished kinks, and left it lying tidy, a pale sleeping serpent on packed soil. He pointed out a leak along the chicken roof where last night's breathless mist had found a seam. She added a shingle, sealed it, and wiped the hammer head before it went home. Then came saddling. Lila checked blanket smoothness, cinched tension, and bit wear, walked the gelding in a quiet circle, listened for stones and removed one from a hoof with care that kept manners intact. She lacked bulk, yet precision bridged every gap. Jonah gave short praise in a tone that counted. It put a narrow smile on the corner of her mouth and made the yard feel less heavy. Mid-morning heat arrived like a bill, dew and sharp, dust walked in the air. Drought sat at every table in the county, an uninvited guest that never left. Tanks sank, grass rasped under hoof. Elias kept a ledger in his head, Lila kept one on paper. After chores she wiped her hands, took a sharpened pencil, and set figures straight at the big table. She copied totals, corrected 2 transpositions, circled a freight charge that did not match the distance, and flagged a salt supplier who raised prices after storms as if the weather were an accomplice. She did not posture over discovery. She simply turned the book, tapped the margin she had marked, and waited for his decision. He thanked her, wrote a note to confront the man, and felt the faint lift that comes when a problem meets a mind willing to wrestle without fuss. Margaret's kitchen gave the day a heart. The stove clicked, the kettle sang, and instruction arrived in soft sentences threaded with patience. Starch the collars until they hold a line, mend along the grain so the patch blends, save bacon grease for tomorrow's cornbread. Lila watched, tried, adjusted, and tried again until the results matched the example. She learned how to open windows so heat escaped without letting grit pour in, how to keep ants from finding sugar, and how to set a table straight, even when plates came from different lives. The cat under the table approved with the impartiality of cats that judge purely by warmth, scent and pace. Lila set down a saucer of milk at the same spot each day, then wiped the floor in firm strokes that made the boards shine. By late morning, Jonah tested her beyond the yard. Coil rope without kinks. Oil the hinge that creaks each time the smokehouse door swings. Replace a split picket. Walk the fence and mark staples that pulled free. Lila lacked height for heavy lifts, yet precision made up for. She could see where a line would fail, and fix the weakness before it became a break. On the way back, she paused beside a shallow tank, noted the level against a nail scab and wrote the number on her palm for later. Jonah saw the habit of recording and approved with a small grunt that was praise in foreman speech. Midday brought ledger work. Elias placed a stack of invoices on the big table, and asked whether she was willing to copy figures, flag errors and propose saving. She agreed after confirming that work would be paid and that refusal would be respected. She squared paper, sharpened a pencil, and drew columns crisp as fence posts at noon. By sundown she had corrected 2 transposed totals, identified a supplier who padded salt prices after storms, and marked a freight charge that did not match the distance. Elias did not say much. He did not need to. He left a small coin by her plate and a note promising regular wages posted on the pantry door where honesty could see itself. Drought pressed its thumb on every choice. Tanks sank, grass rasped, and cattle ribs showed. Elias sold 2 longhorns early to buy seed that might wither, and each decision felt like carving a tool from the tool itself. Margins narrowed like a noose. Lila made the arithmetic honest, not she asked where they could endure loss and where a single mistake would break them. Then organized tasks, so waste had fewer chances to hide. She learned which pastures still held shade, which windmill had a temper, and which supplier bent when faced with clean figures and a quiet stare that refused to blink. Not every hour passed smoothly. Caleb Holt, a recent hire with pale eyes and a grin that never reached them, drifted near the pump too often. He spoke compliments in a tone with burrs, stood too close while she nodded rawhide, and once reached for her braid as if it were a rope he owned. She stepped away before contact, told him to keep distance, and returned to work without giving him a sliver of reaction to pocket. When he laughed she met his stare until the grin slipped. She reported the nuisance to Margaret first, then to Elias in 3 sentences stripped of drama. Both listened, and both set lines. Jonah took Caleb aside and explained ranch law in words that did not invite debate. The message landed, though resentment flickered behind those pale eyes like heat above a road. Afternoons returned to the kitchen and the quiet art of keeping a home from frame. Margaret taught pastry that flaked, soap that lifted stains, and a broth that pulled strength from bones. Lila learned the touch that smooths sheets, the fold that fits a drawer and the timing that turns chores into rhythm. She added a small board by the door listing soon-to-run items so trips to town would be efficient. Lamp oil, bluing, needles, oats, vinegar. Margaret traced a finger down that list and smiled like someone who had just watched a gate swing on new hinges. Elias watched with a care that did not intrude. He saw that Lila never turned her back to an open doorway, that she mapped every room for exits, that she moved with a readiness earned by hard winters and harder men. He respected the caution and feted assignments that built trust. Ride the east fence with Jonah, spot a low place before it washed, sort mail for the ledger, draft a letter to the bank that sounded prudent rather than desperate. When she grew tired she adjusted her pace rather than quit, and the ranch answered by becoming a place where endurance looked almost like grace. Saturday evening brought a walk to the East Ridge where the land unrolled like an old quilt, sun picking gold from brittle grass. They spoke about payments due, feed costs, and wells that groaned. Lila proposed dividing grazing in shorter rotations, selling scrap iron in town, and inviting neighboring widowers to stable a few animals for a small fee that included water when available. None of it solved the weather, yet the plan stacked small answers until they formed something that looked like a ladder. Margaret slipped her arm through Lila's and did not apologize for tenderness. Caleb did not vanish entirely. He tested edges with remarks dropped like nails. Lila met each with clarity, never heat. Once he blocked a shed door with his shoulder. She stepped sideways, tapped the frame, and said she would call Jonah if the path stayed closed. He moved, pride bruised him more than threat. He preferred conquest to confrontation. Word spread that the girl was not frightened, and the matter cooled. As weeks gathered, the ranch began to feel like a living sum with balanced parts. Dawn brought hens, chores, accounts, and the soft percussion of hoofbeats beyond the yard. Evenings brought lamplight, quiet talk, and a weariness that felt earned rather than empty. Lila carried herself with the same guarded grace she had brought from Galveston, yet warmth slipped in around the edges. Margaret saw it and loved her faster than she thought possible, not as charity but as recognition. The bond did not try to rewrite history, it offered a future that could be held without dropping anything essential. Elias noticed that his table felt larger without adding a single board. Before sleep, Lila wrote in a small book she kept tucked beneath the mattress, notes on water levels, figures from the feed store, reminders for tomorrow, and a single line that surprised her with its honesty and reach. Have you ever found hope in unexpected places? Share below. She closed the book, blew out the lamp, and listened to the wind moving through the wire like a low harp. Work had not softened the drought, yet purpose had softened the hours. Morning would rise, tasks would wait, and she would meet them with the same steady hands that had carried her this far. Night leaned over the Carter place with a dry hush that made every small sound feel magnified. And Lila asked Elias to walk the east fence before supper, saying she wanted to show him something that would not sit right inside four walls. He took a lantern but kept its hood down, trusting moonlight to guide them and not announce their path to anyone who might be studying the ranch from a ridge. Wind carried dust in thin veils. Grass whispered. The windmill counted off seconds in a click that made worry feel measurable. Lila held a flat parcel wrapped in stained canvas and tied with a clerk's careful knot. She did not speak for the first 100 yards, only checked shadows and the line of posts, listening for a misstep that would warn her if the night had more than crickets in it. When they reached the notch where a mesquite leaned across broken stone, she stopped, passed him the parcel, and said she had tried to keep this separate from their lives because secrets grow teeth. But separation was no longer possible. Inside the wrap lay a worn ledger bound in black boards, corners blunted, pages numbered in a tidy hand. Elias opened to the center and saw rows of figures, dates, initials, wrought notes, and odd marks that might be signals rather than letters. The ink kept steady under pressure, a professional bookkeeper's line that never trembled. Lila said she learned that hand by tracing it until she could copy it and then by adding columns. None of the men noticed because they never looked for a girl's work beyond errands. She said the book belonged to Victor Slade, who used a counting house near the waterfront to disguise a network that reached inland with the same quiet patience whales use when they find a vein. Freight, bonds, cattle, whiskey, wagers, bodies. The categories shifted but the money always found the same pockets. She had been the one to total shipments, square balances, and note which deputies looked away. She came faster with sums than most grown clerks, which made her valuable until the day she noticed a line that tied a burned barn to a set of initials and a schedule that matched the night it fell. She confronted a senior man by correcting a total and leaving the damning margin visible, watched his eyes harden, and realized that skill without power is bait. That night she copied names in a private hand and hid the originals beneath crates of rope. She said Slade liked to test loyalty by making people destroy something that once fed them, and though he presented cruelty as economy, he enjoyed the test more than the math. She decided to leave only after she learned that a wagon of children had been diverted to a buyer who paid for silence with threats instead of cash. The ledger under Elias's hands recorded that diversion without sentiment. She stole it on a morning when fog covered the docks and the man with the scar on his jaw argued about a surcharge, slid the book beneath her shawl, bolted through an alley and did not stop until she reached a street where church bells drowned footsteps. Every move since had been a set of contingencies wrapped around a hope that someone decent would give her time to turn the book into safety. Elias turned another page, read a column where freight weights aligned too neatly with dates for storms that had closed the port, and understood that the neatness proved fraud rather than honest planning. He closed the covers, looked at her and said he respected the courage it took to turn against a man whose shadow kneecaps the town. Respect did not quiet his worry. If Slade's people guessed where the book had gone, they would not send letters or lawyers. They would come at night, ride hard and treat a home like a ledger that needed red ink. He asked why she had not burned the thing. She said destruction leaves you with nothing but fear, while leverage buys days and days buy choice. He nodded because the clarity matched what he had already seen in her, a refusal to accept the false peace of pretending danger had departed. They turned back toward the house. Over the ridge, a faint glint flared, winked out, then returned, far too steady for a star and too small for a lantern. Elias lowered the lantern hood completely. Lila angled her body so the scrub cut her outline against the sky. That glint reappeared a third time, like a spyglass catching moon at the edge of a patient eye. They moved the last stretch in silence, broken only by the windmill's patient tick and a distant coyote calling across bone-dry flats. Inside, Margaret had stew ready and worry banked. She read their faces, set bowls down and listened as Elias summarized what the ledgers meant. Lila filled the spaces he left, keeping to facts, never asking for pity, never posing as a martyr. Margaret reached for her hand with a tenderness that made the girl go still, as if surprise had paused breath. Then Margaret squeezed and said the house would not let men like Slade turn a young woman's life into a note on a balance sheet, not while she had breath or sense. She spoke of adoption as if it were weather that had already begun, naming paperwork, promises and church witness. Elias felt warmth at her resolve and an ache that rose from a different conviction. He wanted to say yes because love had stepped into the room and asked for a seat. He also wanted to guard the autonomy that had carried Lila through storms no vow could revert. He said they should move as if a lawyer sat in every doorway because every signature alters power, and until Slade's reach was measured, he would not add marks to a document that might put a target on a name. Margaret answered that love already paints a target, and she would rather hold the truth in daylight than pretend safety grows in shadows. Lila listened to them argue gently, cheeks flushing at the thought that anyone would claim her on paper or in public. She said she could accept a partnership before adoption if partnership meant trust in decisions and an understanding that she was not property. Margaret kissed her hair and said motherhood is many things, including the skill of holding close without closing a door. Elias promised they would draft a plan that included a town lawyer they could trust, a pastor who knew when to keep silent, and a timeline that did not rush simply to quiet fear. He added that until rain fell, cash remained thin, and any formal process needed fees that could not appear from dust. The drought reached through that exchange and tugged at hope like a thief. Tanks fell another inch that week. Cattle ribs showed like the rungs of a ladder you'd rather not climb. A wind came up that scoured paint from corners and made the porch complain. Margaret kept feeding, mending and praying with her hands. Elias sold 2 more head to buy time and traded scrap for nails to keep fences honest. Lila ran numbers to minimize waste and sent a letter to a feed merchant, whose invoices never quite matched weights, asking for reconciliation in a tone so calm it refused offense while promising accountability. Work steadied the fear, but signs persisted. Twice, Jonah found prints on the far side of the north fence where nobody had any business walking. Once, Lila caught the faint scent of cigar smoke when the wind lay down toward sunset, a smell that did not belong to anyone in their outfit. Another night she saw that same small flare on the ridge and measured how frequently it returned, as though the watcher had learned patience from a tide chart. She began carrying the ledger in a flour tin when she worked in the kitchen, in a wrapped bundle when she checked tanks, and beneath the mattress when she tried to sleep. Elias started stacking rails against windows that faced the ridge, kept the rifle oiled, and posted watches that rotated so fatigue would not blur judgment. Margaret kept her courage visible, which is different from pretending fear is foolish. She would set a cup by Lila's hand, smooth a collar, say a prayer while folding towels, and never make safety sound like a favor owed. They spoke openly about lines, no one alone at night, no riding out without a second set of eyes, no assumptions about strangers asking for water. Lila made copies of key pages and hid them in 3 places even Jonah did not know, because survival sometimes means treating knowledge like a seed. While they worked, while they hoped for a kind sky, while they debated papers and names, Lila wrote one sentence in the small book she kept tucked beneath a loose floorboard. What secrets have shaped your path? Let us know. She closed the cover and slid it back, then checked the window one more time, watching the ridge as if the horizon itself had become a ledger line that might break. Pre-dawn stillness pressed against the Carter house like held breath. A dry hush broken only by the windmill's lazy tick and the soft creak of boards cooling after a long, sleepless night. Elias lay awake, boots against the bed frame, mind mapping corridors, corners and fields of fire when the dog under the porch rumbled a warning that didn't rise into a bark. Jonah Blake stood from his chair by the east window and tilted the curtain with a fingertip. A thin smear of dust crawled along the northern track, then separated into 5 shapes riding low, hats pulled, bandanas high. Caleb Holt led them with a posture that advertised borrowed courage, pale eyes shining the way road mirages shine before heat. Elias tapped the rifle stock, breathed once and knocked softly on Lila's door. She was already up, hair braided tight, dress cinched, hands steady around the short shotgun he had cleaned the night before. Margaret set a lamp without lighting it and whispered the rules they had drilled. Keep low, watch angles, speak only when needed, trust the plan. Lila nodded, slipped extra shells into a pocket, and took her post by the kitchen doorway where the yard opened like a stage. Jonah slid the dining table against the front window to build a waist-high barricade, and set a box of cartridges within easy reach. Elias checked the back door crossbar, cracked it 2 inches and studied the barn shadow where horses stamped and snorted. The sky held a gray seam along the horizon, not yet light, not quite night. A moment built for ambush. The riders fanned across the yard with the caution of men who expected rifles and meant to smother them with number. Caleb raised a gloved hand and called out that he had business with a runaway bookkeeper and a missing ledger belonging to a respectable firm. His voice tried for official and landed on oily. Elias answered that any firm sending masked men before dawn forfeited the word respectable. Caleb laughed like a shovel striking rock. Behind him 2 riders peeled toward the barn. Another drifted toward the smokehouse and one kept to the pump, revolver low. Elias signaled Jonah with a small motion. The foreman fired first, a clean crack that shattered the pump handle and sprayed the yard with a glittering arc. Men flinched. Lila stepped into the doorway, leveled the shotgun, and said she would speak for herself. Her voice carried like a ledger total spoken at the end of a long argument. Caleb's grin faltered. He said Slade wanted the book and the girl in either order and the difference mattered only to folks interested in breathing. Lila told him the book was a claim against crimes catalogued by names, dates, routes and prices. Taking it by force would only add fresh lines to future testimony. Caleb shrugged and tipped 2 fingers. Gunfire hammered the front wall, plaster popped. Margaret pulled Lila back a step, while buckshot scraped paint from the jam. Elias shot the hat off the man creeping toward the smokehouse, then dropped the next round into the dirt an inch from Caleb's boot. A warning meant to measure how much show the man could endure before pride required blood. Jonah worked the lever with the economy of someone who had trained his hands to speak without waste. A rider by the barn fired wild, spooking the gelding and earning a kick that sent him sprawling. Lila counted shots the way she counted exits in Galveston, then chambered, leaned and fired a blast that chewed the wheel of a wagon, sending splinters into the shins of a man who had been edging for the porch. Smoke thickened, the windmill ticked on, indifferent. Dust rose from hooves like breath from a sleeping bull. Elias called to Caleb that leaving now would preserve bones for future walking. Caleb replied by lifting a spyglass, flashing a cold wink of light toward the ridge, and signaling reinforcements crouched beyond the fence. Shadows detached from the brush, 8 more shapes with carbines and a burlap sack meant for a captive. Margaret's hand tightened on Lila's shoulder, then let go because a grip sometimes breaks focus. Lila stepped forward just enough to be seen and said Slade's accounts would bleed whether they took her or not. Pieces already sat in safe places where friends of the law could retrieve them. Caleb's jaw twitched. He called her bluff and promised to test. Elias sensed the arc bending toward waste and chose a different line. He told Caleb the ranch would trade the ledger for safe withdrawal with a witness to the promise and daylight to verify distance. Caleb pretended to consider, then gestured for proof. Lila lifted a flour tin from beneath the stove, removed a wrapped bundle and held it high without stepping past the threshold. She said the tin held the record that could end several enterprises if placed before the right reader. A bullet clipped the doorframe. She didn't flinch. Jonah swore softly, and put a neat hole through the hat of the man who fired. Caleb snarled that talking bored him. He ordered his line to advance and fired at the lantern on the porch, shattering glass into bright falling knives. Elias felt the moment tilt. He shouted now. Lila snapped the bundle against the jamb, let pages scatter like startled birds and dove left while Jonah laid down a raking line that punched dust from boots and tore fringe from chaff. Margaret yanked a curtain across the window, then slid another box of shells within reach with the calm of someone centering a pie on a cooling rack. The house breathed with them, boards flexing, nails singing their thin metallic tune under stress. Caleb lifted both hands and said the next volley would light the porch unless the girl stepped out unarmed. Lila offered terms. She would walk to the trough with a broken shotgun and the ledger visible if every muzzle faced dirt. Caleb nodded. Elias moved to refuse. Margaret caught his sleeve. Jonah counted breaths. Lila stepped into gray light, set the open shotgun on the trough and raised a rapt volume. She said Slade could trade distance for pages that could gut his trade. Caleb laughed and stared at her. Lila ripped the bundle, palmed a bottle hidden in the spine, smashed it and slapped red across her dress. Jonah shot the soil to kick up dust while Margaret pulled her behind the stone. Elias dropped a man who lunged. Caleb swore, ducked, and hesitated. A horn sounded beyond the ridge, stirring doubt. He ordered withdrawal, promising return with papers and fire. The line backed out, firing wildly to hide retreat, then dwindled to smudges. Lila sat up, breath rough, face pale beneath the painted stain. Elias, Margaret and Jonah steadied the room. Lila slid the true book under a floorboard and wrote on a scrap. When have you faced danger for family? Share your story. Wind moved ash from the lantern. The sun lifted, colorless. On the ridge a spyglass winked, then died. Calm returned like a truce and the house learned to breathe without trusting quiet. Morning after the attack arrived clean and hard. As if the sky had scrubbed itself while the Carter house relearned breathing. Smoke clung to splinters near the porch where glass had rained, yet ash drifted into gray and the windmill ticked without hurry. Elias walked the yard with Jonah, reading tracks and bullet scars. They counted casings, patched planks, straightened a hinge and drove new nails where boards had loosened. Margaret aired rooms, mopped oil and brewed coffee strong enough to quiet shake. Lila stayed steady. Sleeves rolled, braid tight, eyes clear. She cleared debris, sanded the jam and swept thresholds until the broom whispered. Work steadied hearts better than speeches. By noon Elias rode to town with Jonah and hired 2 seasoned hands who understood watches and silence. Ben Turner carried a scar on his temple. Robert Pike moved like a man trained by hard places. They took posts along the ridge, studied approach lines and built a rotation that slept only as prudence allowed. Jonah pointed out low draws and the spot where a spyglass had winked. Elias set rules plain as fence law: no boasting, no shots unless threat crossed a line, no talk in town. That evening, with posts manned and animals calmed, the house exhaled. Margaret ladled stew, cut cornbread and eased Lila into a chair as if rest were a skill. Elias thanked everyone without ceremony, then faced the girl who had painted herself with false blood and held steady under fire. He said courage had saved lives. Lila answered that gratitude should become better systems, not monument. She proposed an ammunition count, discreet water runs when riders patrolled outer fences, and a messenger code with the postmaster. Elias listened, wrote notes and recognized leadership wearing humility. After the dishes, Margaret brought a tin box holding documents, letters and a small locket. She spoke gently, saying the house had made a daughter of a brave young woman and paper should follow truth. Lila set both palms on polished wood, thanked her and said she wanted a belonging that did not erase her path, and she wished to earn a place by skill. Elias agreed, not to delay love but to honor independence. He proposed a season of partnership first, wages regular, authority matching duties, shared decisions and a promise to revisit signatures when the dust settled. Margaret's eyes shone, relieved to hear autonomy beside care. Lila promised to treat the ranch as a mission, not a shelter alone. Trust deepened more in that exchange than in any vow shouted across a yard. The weeks that followed centered on learning. Elias taught management as a river. He laid out maps of grazing, water rights, drive routes and winter feed, then asked Lila to recommend changes for drought. She divided ideas into essentials, negotiables and risks, penciling rotations that protected pasture while keeping cattle near reliable tanks. Jonah unfolded brands, books and purchase histories and took her along whenever he inspected a line. She learned to read earth like a ledger. Hoof churn meaning crowding, fresh rub marks on mesquite, signaling restless stock, faint rills after a sprinkle revealing where a cut might blow out. Back at the table she aligned invoices, caught a duplicate fee and drafted a letter that recovered funds without starting a feud. Ben and Pike trained her in watch rotation and signaling so patrols could coordinate without shouting. She walked night routes until foot memory matched ground, counted steps from porch to trough in the dark, and measured how sound carried when air turned brittle. Margaret kept building resilience. Jars tightened just enough, knots smoothed, schedules balanced so laundry, baking, books, livestock and meetings synchronized. Through every hour the land stayed honest about hardship. Days rose gold as a tarnished coin, wind combed grass, and sun bleached hills until dusk washed everything in copper. Tanks sank, ribs showed and money required triage. Elias sold culls early, bartered repairs for feed and negotiated with suppliers who respected straight talk backed by arithmetic. Lila built charts that forecast shortages weeks ahead, turned scraps into replacement parts, and persuaded a blacksmith to salvage hinges in exchange for bookkeeping. The place steadied not because the weather softened, but because attention threaded every task. Neighbors noticed discipline and sent small requests for help with books, letters or plans. One day a widow from 3 miles south arrived with a boy whose quiet reminded Lila of a mirror she avoided when life demanded speed. His name was Thomas, 9, sleeves too short, eyes fixed on doorways. Margaret gave him bread, jam and time enough to choose a second slice. Lila showed him the woodpile, let him help with kindling, then placed a pencil in his hand and drew a simple ledger for chores and reward. A month later came 2 sisters from a freight stop downriver. Then a stooped grandfather brought a girl with a smashed violin, who slept with the case clasped to her chest. Elias did not turn anyone away when space and cash allowed. He met each arrival with clear rules, work matched to strength, pay in coins or goods, and schooling at the table every evening. Margaret found room in corners nobody had noticed, rotated quilts, and hung a curtain that turned a porch alcove into a snug. Jonah added a bunk in the loft. Ben built a latch for the pantry that Thomas installed under supervision. Lila kept books for the growing household with the same care she once gave secret ledgers, only now every line honored living. She tracked flour, beans, soap, candles, kerosene, seed, nails and cloth, created a chart for water draws so tanks rested, penciled a schedule that rotated heavy chores and reserved an hour after supper for reading aloud. Talk about adoption rose again by lamplight. Margaret spoke about permanence, birthdays recognized, futures named with certainty. Elias added that the paper could protect rights if illness struck or if distant cousins came sniffing after acid. Lila said she longed for a family whose promises did not depend on the weather, yet believed signing should follow a season-proving partnership under pressure. They agreed on winter as a time to return to town, see the pastor and speak with a lawyer. Margaret trusted. Until then they would live truth daily, shared authority, wages kept current, responsibilities widened as capacity grew. Elias and Lila studied dusky fields, naming which sections might survive another dry month, which calves needed moving, and which fences deserved wire before windstorm season. The beauty did not cancel hardship, it framed effort with something like a blessing. The dusty, golden country stretched under an enormous sky, fierce and honest, demanding respect and offering muted splendor to those who stayed true. In that light, trust no longer felt like a gamble, it felt like a crop slowly ripening while wind hummed through wire and a house at the heart of wide land. Learned to be fuller without surrendering hard-won calm. They kept going, steady, together, unafraid. Morning after the attack arrived clean and hard, as if the sky had scrubbed itself while the Carter house relearned breathing. Smoke clung to splinters near the porch where glass had rained, yet ash drifted into gray and the windmill ticked without hurry. Elias walked the yard with Jonah, reading tracks and bullet scars. They counted casings, patched planks, straightened a hinge and drove new nails where boards had loosened. Margaret aired rooms, mopped oil and brewed coffee strong enough to quiet shake. Lila stayed steady, sleeves rolled braid tight, eyes clear. She cleared debris, sanded the jam and swept thresholds until the broom whispered. Work steadied hearts better than speeches. By noon Elias rode to town with Jonah and hired 2 seasoned hands who understood watches and silence. Ben Turner carried a scar on his temple. Robert Pike moved like a man trained by hard places. They took posts along the ridge, studied approach lines and built a rotation that slept only as prudence allowed. Jonah pointed out low draws and the spot where a spyglass had winked. Elias set rules plain as fence law: no boasting, no shots unless threat crossed a line, no talk in town. That evening, with posts manned and animals calmed, the house exhaled. Margaret ladled stew, cut cornbread and eased Lila into a chair as if rest were a skill. Elias thanked everyone without ceremony, then faced the girl who had painted herself with false blood and held steady under fire. He said courage had saved lives. Lila answered that gratitude should become better systems, not monuments. She proposed an ammunition count, discreet water runs when riders patrolled outer fences, and a messenger code with the postmaster. Elias listened, wrote notes and recognized leadership wearing humility. After the dishes, Margaret brought a tin box holding documents, letters and a small locket. She spoke gently, saying the house had made a daughter of a brave young woman and paper should follow truth. Lila set both palms on polished wood, thanked her and said she wanted a belonging that did not erase her path, and she wished to earn a place by skill. Elias agreed, not to delay love but to honor independence. He proposed a season of partnership first, wages regular, authority matching duties, shared decisions and a promise to revisit signatures when the dust settled. Margaret's eyes shone, relieved to hear autonomy beside care. Lila promised to treat the ranch as a mission, not a shelter alone. Trust deepened more in that exchange than in any vow shouted across a yard. The weeks that followed centered on learning. Elias taught management as a river. He laid out maps of grazing, water rights, drive routes and winter feed, then asked Lila to recommend changes for drought. She divided ideas into essentials, negotiables and risks, penciling rotations that protected pasture while keeping cattle near reliable tanks. Jonah unfolded brands, books and purchase histories and took her along whenever he inspected a line. She learned to read earth like a ledger, hoof churn meaning crowding, fresh rub marks on mesquite, signaling restless stock, faint rills after a sprinkle revealing where a cut might blow out. Back at the table she aligned invoices, caught a duplicate fee and drafted a letter that recovered funds without starting a feud. Ben and Pike trained her in watch rotation and signaling so patrols could coordinate without shouting. She walked night routes until foot memory matched ground, counted steps from porch to trough in the dark, and measured how sound carried when air turned brittle. Margaret kept building resilience. Jars tightened just enough, not smoothed, schedules balanced so laundry, baking, books, livestock and meetings synchronized. Through every hour the land stayed honest about hardship. Days rose gold as a tarnished coin, wind combed grass, and sun bleached hills until dusk washed everything in copper. Tanks sank, ribs showed and money required triage. Elias sold culls early, bartered repairs for feed and negotiated with suppliers who respected straight talk backed by arithmetic. Lila built charts that forecast shortages weeks ahead, turned scraps into replacement parts, and persuaded a blacksmith to salvage hinges in exchange for bookkeep. The place steadied not because the weather softened, but because attention threaded every task. Neighbors noticed discipline and sent small requests for help with books, letters or plans. One day a widow from 3 miles south arrived with a boy whose quiet reminded Lila of a mirror she avoided when life demanded speed. His name was Thomas, 9, sleeves too short, eyes fixed on doorways. Margaret gave him bread, jam and time enough to choose a second slice. Lila showed him the woodpile, let him help with kindling, then placed a pencil in his hand and drew a simple ledger for chores and reward. A month later came 2 sisters from a freight stop downriver, then a stooped grandfather brought a girl with a smashed violin, who slept with the case clasped to her chest. Elias did not turn anyone away when space and cash allowed. He met each arrival with clear rules: work matched to strength, pay in coins or goods, and schooling at the table every evening. Margaret found room in corners nobody had noticed, rotated quilts, and hung a curtain that turned a porch alcove into a snug. Jonah added a bunk in the loft, then built a latch for the pantry that Thomas installed under supervision. Lila kept books for the growing household with the same care she once gave secret ledgers, only now every line honored living. She tracked flour, beans, soap, candles, kerosene, seed, nails and cloth, created a chart for water draws so tanks rested, penciled a schedule that rotated heavy chores and reserved an hour after supper for reading aloud. Talk about adoption rose again by lamplight. Margaret spoke about permanence, birthdays recognized, futures named with certainty. Elias added that the paper could protect rights if illness struck or if distant cousins came sniffing after assets. Lila said she longed for a family whose promises did not depend on the weather, yet believed signing should follow a season-proving partnership under pressure. They agreed on winter as a time to return to town, see the pastor and speak with a lawyer. Margaret trusted. Until then they would live truth daily, shared authority, wages kept current, responsibilities widened as capacity grew. Elias and Lila studied dusky fields, naming which sections might survive another dry month, which calves needed moving, and which fences deserved wire before windstorm season. The beauty did not cancel hardship, it framed effort with something like a blessing. The dusty, golden country stretched under an enormous sky, fierce and honest, demanding respect and offering muted splendor to those who stayed true. In that light, trust no longer felt like a gamble. It felt like a crop slowly ripening while wind hummed through wire and a house at the heart of wide land. Learned to be fuller without surrendering hard-won calm. They kept going, steady, together, unafraid. By the spring of 1892, the Carter place carried itself with the measured confidence of a ship that had learned every current in its bay. And Lila, 19 now, set the course. She rose before the horizon brightened, checked the tallies chalked beneath the pantry shelf, read the night log Ben Turner kept, and added neat figures to the big ledger whose spine had been mended so often it looked like a map of choices. Columns marched, debts narrowed, and every entry spoke a language she had wrestled into honesty. Cattle moved, feed bought, fences stretched, wages counted, seed reserved, freight bargained, notes renegotiated without surrender. Elias brought coffee, set it near her elbow, and waited while she finished a column because patience meant as well as voice. When she closed the book he slid a folded deed across the table. Margaret stood by the south window with sunlight combing her hair and said what the paper meant out loud. Equal standing, equal say, equal share of burden, equal share of grace. Lila read the lines twice, then signed with a steady hand that refused tremor, and Elias set his name beside hers while Margaret pressed a small cross as witness. No speech followed, only a quiet exhale and the sensation of a house learning a new shape without breaking. Jonah Blake came in from the yard, wiped grit from his palms, and shook Lila's hand as though greeting a trail boss at the railhead. Work resumed instantly, because a celebration that refuses work grows brittle. The ranch had become a refuge that year by design more than accident. Every spring brought a wagon or a rider leading someone who needed steadiness, a girl who hid a bruised violin in a flour sack, 3 brothers whose father had gone north and never wrote, a toddler carried by a cousin with grief weathering her face, a boy who refused to speak above a whisper. Lila received each arrival with the same practical kindness that had kept her breathing during lean years. A meal first, a wash basin, a bed, a set of rules explained without sting, wages for work, school at the table, respect without spectacle, record-keeping made welcome durable. She kept an enrollment list, a chores ledger, a schedule that protected study time, and a small purse seeded each month for boots, pins and mending so dignity did not depend on charity. Elias handled stock and water while teaching older boys to ride a circle, noticing weak wire before it failed. Margaret guarded the hearth, stitched names into quilts, and taught a dozen quiet arts that hold a household together when weather leans hard. Ben and Robert rotated patrols until vigilance felt like custom rather than fear. Across the hills, the drought still worked its slow arithmetic, yet beauty persisted with an obstinate will. Morning painted brittle grass in pale gold, noon hammered the ridges flat as coin, and evening laid copper across stone until everything shone like embers that refused to die. Yucca spears stood with fierce dignity, mesquite threw tight ovals of shade, and wind combed the wire until it hummed like a low harp. In that severe splendor, Lila felt the same lesson repeat. Resilience grows when attention and mercy travel together. Mid-year a rider appeared at dusk with dust in his lashes, and a boy hidden behind the saddle cantle. The boy slid down without letting go of the worn strap, eyes narrow with calculation, jaw set the way hunger sets it. He said his name was Thomas, and nothing else. The rider said he had found him near the rail spur picking through crates, that men from town had chased him twice, and that a place with order might keep him from vanishing between tracks. Lila studied the boy's stance, saw the small pivot that keeps escape possible, the deep pockets of silence where secrets learn to sleep, and recognized a version of herself at 14. She asked whether he preferred stew first or shoes first. He said She ladled a bowl heavy with beans and beef, set a square of cornbread beside it, and placed a tin cup so water would touch his tongue before he told any more of his story. Margaret brought soap and a towel, then a shirt cut down to Elias asked if Thomas understood the rules that kept children safe here. No one touched without consent, no one took without asking, no one left alone after dark, and every job carried pay, not humiliation. Thomas listened without moving his gaze from the doorway and nodded once. That night he slept on a pallet by the kitchen where Heat lived, Boots tucked against the wall as if Boots could try walking away in the dark. At dawn, Lila found him already awake watching the way steam rose from the kettle, counting spoons and noting X. She handed him a short list in careful script: carry wood, feed the hens, sweep the porch, bring 2 buckets to the trough. Payment clinked on the table, 2 nickels, a stub pencil and a promise of school after supper. He did the work with a wary precision that made every movement look like a test. By noon he had memorized the distance from the kitchen door to the pump-in steps, the number of posts between house and smokehouse, and the shortest line from porch to corral without crossing the yard center, where exposure felt like accusation. Lila gave him rope to coil and taught the trick that banishes kinks. He watched her hands with fox alertness and matched the motion until the rope lay like a pale sleeping serpent. Margaret taught him how to fold a sheet so the corners kicked. Elias set him on a calm gelding and walked a slow circle so the balance could learn calm. That first week, Thomas answered every question with the smallest unit required, but his eyes changed when he realized that meals arrived without debt and coins arrived without trap. He found scraps of wire for Jonah, tightened a latch, oiled a squealing hinge and drew a map of the yard from memory that included every obstacle a runner might use. In the evenings, with lamplight steady and the hills cooling outside like bread on a sill, Lila taught sums using ranch books. Thomas learned to add feed weights, subtract loss, and divide wages so fairness met reality. He copied figures, corrected one of his own transpositions before she reached it, and allowed the smallest smile to escape when she tapped the margin where accuracy had lived. That same night Margaret placed a quilt over him while he pretended to sleep. He did not move until she withdrew, then slid a hand to touch the stitched T she had added and left it there as if letters could anchor drifting. Partnership changed rhythms across the outfit. Lila and Elias made decisions together openly. She argued to rotate grazing faster along the west pasture, so grass could breathe, pushed for a windmill repair before it failed, and proposed selling 2 steers early to cover winter salt while prices held decent. Elias argued to hold a yearling back. They shook hands, partners under a vast sky. In 1903 the Carter Ranch was known from Galveston wharves to the limestone hills beyond the Pecos. Not for ease but for the way attention, grit and mercy had turned a hard valley into refuge. Wind still combed wire like a low harp. Dust still drifted in patient veils and sun still pressed hot coins of light on stone, yet the place breathed with order learned across years of work. Children once delivered by freight wagons, deputies, cousins or pure chance now ran their hands along smooth rails they had sanded, read pages they had once feared, kept tidy ledgers and saddled geldings with care that made animals flick their ears in trust. Elias walked more slowly these days, not from defeat, but from the luxury of studying what stubborn kindness had built. Margaret kept the kitchen steady and the porch bright, stitching names into quilts so belonging could be touched. Lila, 29 now, moved through it all with thoughtful calm, the sure center that purpose had found. That afternoon dignitaries rolled in behind a drift of ceremonial dust: a state senator with careful boots, 2 county officials who had learned to prefer facts, a railroad man whose invoices had flattened since reform, a pastor with a voice that could soothe, and 3 women from a civic guild carrying notebooks tied with ribbon. They climbed down, blinking in the gold, and asked for the woman whose name had begun to travel with stories about second chances made practical. Lila met them near the windmill, shook hands without fuss, and guided them through a yard where everything had a reason and a place. They saw a shelf of labeled bolts and washers reclaimed from scrap, a shaded corner where a toddler stacked blocks while a teenager balanced feed weights against delivery slips, a chalkboard listing chores, wages and lessons, water posts with tick marks proving careful draws. In the big room, Lila spoke plainly. The ranch was rescued because it refused to treat children as charity or labor, only as citizens in the making. Food, safety, school, wages for work, rules that protected dignity, books that taught arithmetic and law, letters to officials written in clear script, and a habit of daylight on all accounts. She did not reach for grand work. She held out bread still warm, a ledger without smudges, and a map of wells dug where the land had whispered yes. When the floor opened for testimony, former residents stepped forward like sturdy fence posts set evenly down a long line. Clara, once the girl who hid a broken violin in a flour sack, played a bright reel, then told how she now teaches 50 students in a windy schoolhouse where music stitches stray attention back into afternoon. Ruth described a dressmaking shop where 2 apprentices earn coin and learn figures. Daniel spoke about running a small freight line that refuses to cheat on weights. Elsie told of nursing in a town that once called her an orphan and now calls her trusted. Each voice named one truth learned here. Work paired with fairness grows courage, and courage repeated becomes culture. The senator asked about danger. Lila said that pressure, records and allies had thinned old threat. After the night Caleb Holt led men through this yard, copies of incriminating pages traveled to lawmen with backbone and to editors who valued evidence over rumor. Slade fled under indictments, his ledgers burned or seized, his network scattered by patience and public life. The ranch did not celebrate revenge. It celebrated safety, then returned to chores. She turned to finance because a mission without numbers collapses. She showed contracts negotiated honestly, a reserve for dry months, a fund marked education, accounts for wages paid in coin, not promises, and lists of donors who gave without change. She outlined how each child entered with a work plan, a study plan and a guardian plan, and how inspection days arrived unannounced because surprise keeps systems honest. Margaret stood with hands folded, eyes bright, and told the guild how dignity grows when plates carry enough even in lean years, when quilts carry names, when rules never shift to suit the powerful. Elias added that wells, fences and books all require mending, and that the ranch's secret was simply the refusal to let anything fray unseen. Then came a quiet that felt ceremonial without pushing anyone to whisper. Lila looked toward the east fence where Yucca still lifted spears against a sky washed clean, and she told the visitors who she had been, a 14-year-old at an auction, ink on her fingers, numbers in her head, a ledger hidden under a shawl, a gaze that counted exits so terror could not count her. She told how Elias had said $50 and then promised rules that felt like handrails, how Margaret had taught bread, soap and steadiness, how Jonah had measured danger with her until bravery turned into protocol, how children kept arriving and the ranch widened rather than closing around fear. She did not cry. She placed memory where it belonged, in service of others, standing where she once stood. The pastor asked what a county might copy. Lila answered, honest bookkeeping, wages for work, zero tolerance for cruelty, school as daily law, not optional garnish. Partnerships with courts that sign papers which protect rather than punish, inspection days shared with citizens, a line in every budget marked safety, and water rights defended for the common good. Applause rose and settled. The railroad man, chastened by his own history, promised freight at cost for school supplies. The senator pledged support for a registry that would stop children from being sold as debt. The guild vowed blankets, books and a small scholarship purse. The sun eased down the far slope and wagons began to turn. Before they left, Thomas, once a wary boy counting exits and now a thoughtful foreman with clean boots and a pencil behind his ear, stepped forward and spoke for those who stayed. He said the ranch had taught him not to be owned by fear or rage, only by purpose. He said leadership here sounded like calm and looked like showing up on time. He said home was not the place that never hurts but the place that never lies. Lila did not add to his words. She placed a hand on his shoulder, proud as any mother might be, and sent him to finish the evening count. Dusk slid toward crimson. Live, Jonah's brother and Lila's husband, stacked benches, then kissed her hair and rode the ridge with Ben and Robert to close the line. The yard thinned to ordinary voices, lamp glow and clinking. A deputy delivered a new arrival, a spare girl with wind-burned cheeks, clutching a wrapped book and a length of twine. Her name was Mina. She asked if the water here was clean. Lila knelt so eyes met level, poured a cup and watched thirst loosen the set of that small mouth. She gave the girl then a slate, then a stub pencil, and drew sums that translated survival into math. Anyone could carry. 2 buckets plus 4 buckets equals 6 buckets. which keeps calves alive. 10 nails plus 6 nails equals 16 nail, which holds a hinge. 1 heart plus many hands equals a house that stands. Margaret stood in the doorway, pride and awe braided on her face. Elias sat on the step rubbing his knee, smiling at the way a new life begins without Trump. When lamps were lit and the horizon burned like a ribbon of molten copper, Lila stepped onto the porch and spoke to the neighbors who had lingered, to the officials who pretended they did not want to hear one last sentence, to the children who had learned to hold still when words mattered, and to the land that had witnessed cruelty and repair. Join our mission for second chances, subscribe, share and help us change lives. She did not shout, she set the line in the air like a crickets tuned their thin choir, wires sang a soft note and a ledger line invisible to everyone but time itself marked another beginning. Then Lila guided Mina's hand across the slate, steady and patient, teaching the stroke of numbers and the shape of letters while the sky went from copper to velvet, and the Carter place glowed like a modest lantern inside the broad stern beauty of Texas night.